What is up, everybody, and welcome. In today's video, we're going to be taking a look at the JD Deventer GOLD. I am super excited to be bringing this knife to you guys. It's sort of been a long time coming. The GOLD model, along with the GOLD Mini, was released towards the end of 2017. I got to play with the prototypes at JD's table at New York Custom Knife Show, and ever since I saw the knife there, I was super excited about it. I've mentioned it in some videos in the past, that came from the show. And honestly, I came really close to buying the prototype that made its way onto Tri-City Customs. But the prototype was basically the same build that you see here, except it had G10 scales. And I'm not usually one for G10, especially on a $1,000 knife. So I messaged JD and, I was like, hey man, I really want this knife. I really like the configuration, but what do you think about a custom order? What do you think about getting some carbon fiber on there? So we worked that out, and a few months later, I had the knife in my hands. So let's go ahead and do a quick size comparison next to the PM2, just so you guys can get a quick little sense of what we're working with. Very similar in size to the PM2, a little bit thicker. It is a contoured liner lock, ever so slightly longer, really not by much. So, a fairly well-sized knife, definitely on the larger side, but not, extraordinarily gargantuan or anything like that. So let's see, I'm gonna go ahead and wipe the knife down and give you guys a nice look at what we're working with here. So sort of the first thing that you'll notice is these Damascus pivot collars. Now, I originally made the assumption that these were manufactured via CNC, but JD was kind enough to point out that no, these are actually turned on a lathe. So you can see this super cool sort of step pattern that is cut into the collars. You can see they're raised. They're very three-dimensional. Super sweet. The colors on these are fantastic. I did send the Damascus out to my friend Adam Purvis to have it recolored, just because Adam knows exactly what I want. And then we have this gorgeous sculpted Damascus clip. Now, I really want to point out sort of the three-dimensionality of the clip, how sculpted it is, how rounded the edges are. A lot of makers these days, I feel like, are doing, they're either doing like milled clips, or even if they do a milled clip, or even if they hand cut their clips, they're not quite doing this much contouring. And for me, contouring goes a long way. So I really like this piece. I like how the pattern sort of wraps around the screw here just a little bit. It's a fun little detail. The clip functions very well. It's in and out of the pocket with one hand. Very convenient, as is my preference. You can see the show side pivot collar. Absolutely stunning. I love these pivot collars. They're something else. We'll take a quick look at the blade. Get this nice and wiped down for you. The blade is a sort of standard, if you will, South African custom configuration with hand-rubbed satin bevels with mirror flats. Absolutely stunning, as is customary on both JD's work and many of these other South African craftsmen. You can see all the things going on with my camera setup in the finish. Absolutely gorgeous. Now, this knife is designed by JVO, who does absolutely fantastic designs that I'm always in love with, no matter which maker is working with him. And he tends to include harpoon-shaped blades in his designs, and that is something I'm quite partial to. So I must say, I'm very attracted to the knife. See, there's a little bit of tape residue on the tip here. I have been using it. And you can see this gorgeous satin swedge here that's worked into the harpoon shape. absolutely fantastic, the curvature we have going on here. I think overall the design of this knife is really spectacular, like really, really next level. I mean, I know that's personal preference, but man, I love it. When I was ordering this knife, I told JD that I pretty much just wanted, the same configuration as the prototype, just with the carbon fiber. And the prototype had like G10 backspacer. And JD told me that he would throw in a little special surprise. And so he started sending me pictures of the knife, but it was only ever from the lock side or from the presentation side. And I started to get a sneaking suspicion that the little surprise that he was going to include for me would be something to do with the backspacer. And sure enough, he's worked with Zircotai, and it is stunning. Absolutely gorgeous. You can see these beautiful polished blue liners. And I was quite honored and surprised and delighted to find this backspacer on my knife. Fantastic. Okay, so let's talk about the action on this knife. You can see the deployment, it really just rockets out. I want to point out first what we're working with in terms of this the flipper tab. You can see here that the tab sort of wraps up around the tang. Here, let me get some light in here. So you can kind of see there's this hollow space, and if you open the knife, the detent and everything is actually sort of hidden behind this cutout. You can see behind the tab how it kind of hooks all the way around, and the lock bar is actually behind or under the tab. And this is really interesting. What it does is it puts the flipper tab very, very high on the knife. You can see how high the contact point for the tab is compared to the pivot, which gives you extraordinary leverage, which is something that, always helps result in good deployment on a knife. Now, JD's knives sort of customarily come with strong detents, and I very much appreciate that. I'm a strong deployment kind of guy. Everybody has their personal preferences, but JD's knives really come with a strong detent. And, if you use a strong detent, that's great, but you need to couple that with good geometry. And so with this flipper tab that's set very high up, you have that really excellent leverage. But he also didn't want to design the knife differently to get the flipper tab up that high. He didn't want to have to carry the tang all the way up that far or anything like that. So it's really interesting that they've sort of added material to the tab that kind of comes up further than the actual contact point with the tang and wraps around the face that contacts the lock face on the lock bar. And so you just get this super, super snappy deployment that fires out like a mother. I mean, anybody who tuned in for my live stream when I was unboxing this knife knows that I was absolutely caught off guard by how fantastic the action was. It is running on multi-row IKBS with ceramic bearings. It's fully loaded as far as I'm concerned in that sense. And so, the lateral stability is really fantastic. It just feels like glass. It's really, really solid. But that interesting geometry and clever work with the flipper tab coupled with the very strong flipper tab gives you that really, really satisfying deployment. Now, I will say one sort of aspect of that where I find this knife is flawed is that the deployment acoustics aren't quite as satisfying as they could be. I got some other big South African knives out so that I could sort of make some comparisons. Now, the gold sounds a lot like the A squared A6 here. So I'm going to flip this. Sounds pretty solid. A little bit higher pitched than the gold. although the gold is slightly louder because the deployment is a little bit stronger. But it still just sort of lacks a little bit of soul. Whereas if you pick up this Thorburn L36M, there's a whole added aspect of the acoustics that gives it a very unique sound. And I would know what this knife was from a mile away. And so that's one area where I could see improvement on the knife is the acoustics. Again, they're not poor. It's quite comparable to this A6. I just, they're not quite as soulful as a Thorburn might be. Now, of course, the second aspect of the action to talk about is the closing. And you know, I really just try to, these days, let the knife speak for itself a little bit. I'm just going to flip the knife a few times for you guys and let you sort of see how it closes. With the multi-row bearings, if anything gets up in there, you know, they can be slowed down by a piece of lint or whatever. So, I don't know, every 30 flips or so, it gets hung up on a little bit of something and then it sort of works its way out. But it's a very hydraulic action in terms of the way it closes. Very similar to like a Thorburn or something like that. Incredibly smooth. And again, on that multi-row IKBS, it's just you can't feel the what's happening in the pivot at all. It's quite fantastic. So this is definitely one of the better actions in my collection. It's really, really great. Now I'm going to talk about a couple of sort of smaller aspects of the knife. One is that this knife does in fact have jeweled liners on the interior. That's a hallmark of JD's knives, and of course many other makers do this as well. But I found that every single Van Deventer knife that I've handled thus far has them, or at least every single one that I've checked. And so that's something that I definitely appreciate. One thing that I would like to be a little bit different on this knife is the screws that are matched with the pivot collars. You can see the screw is kind of plain. They're actually soft. You can see here this one almost started to get stripped out a little bit. So they're softer. I'm not really sure what they're made of. They're sort of colored weird. They don't look anodized quite like titanium. They look like maybe a steel that's been sort of flamed and colored that way. I'm not 100% sure, but I just feel like, I don't know, there could have been something a little bit more stylistically pleasing used to hold the collars down. I appreciate that the color matches the screws in the body, and that the screws in the body, because they're against carbon fiber, sort of fade away into the aesthetics of the knife. You know, oftentimes what we see is just silver screws. And, you know, the silver screws, they really don't look bad, I don't think. But with them being this sort of darker color, it is kind of nice that they fade into the carbon fiber and aren't quite as stark. So the screws I appreciate. The pivot screw that is holding in the collar. You know, on the gold minis, he used actual like pivot screws, like stylized pivot screws. And it's interesting because the mini is such a small knife. And when he does the collars that are like this on the mini, you know, he uses this bigger pivot screw. And it's interesting because I feel like those should be reversed in terms of the scaling between the two knives. I would like to see this smaller screw with sort of less detail used on the mini so that we could get a larger or thicker, if you will, pivot collar on the mini, and that the pivot screw on the mini wasn't so, I think it's like this pivot screw. It's quite large. It's the 3-spoke. And so it sort of takes up a lot of space, and then you don't get as much bang out of the collars. Whereas, you know, if you put this screw on that knife, you'd have a little bit more out of the collar. And then if you took the screw out of the mini and you were to put it into this knife, because it's a bigger knife, I think it can manage the size and still get plenty of space for the collar, as well as add a little bit of stylistic, you know, integrity to the knife. So I don't know, that's like a little criticism. I just find it interesting that he seems to have done that setup in the reverse of how I would have done it if I had been designing the knife. Another small flaw is that the edges aren't chamfered. Now, when I was speaking to JD and some other South African makers when I was in New York, you know, they were sure to tell me You know, sometimes just because something is the way it is doesn't mean that it was a failure on the part of the maker, but rather that it's a design choice. And to be perfectly frank, I think that these edges, you know, they are broken. They're not sharp. It's not like the Francois Masson knives that I had where I pointed out that the edges were 90-degree angles. It's not like that. The edges are broken. It's not sharp. It's not uncomfortable. But I'm preferential, or I'm partial rather, to heavy contouring like what you see on the L36M. So I'm just going to kind of roll the knife, and you can kind of see the light go around this curve on the scale. You can see it's quite curved, quite smoothed out. And on the gold, not so much. It's broken, but it's still sort of a sharp angle. And again, I think that's on purpose. I think that's a design choice, and I think that it doesn't really detract from the knife because, again, the edges are broken. But I am partial to sort of the really heavy contouring. You can see it on this Rio as well. And so that's something that I would have appreciated on this knife. I think the knife overall has a lot of sort of curvature to it. So you can see, I also wanted to mention this milling around the carbon fiber. It's 3D milling with this cool shape all the way through here. So as I show you that, I'm going to kind of talk about the fact that, you know, the whole knife is contoured and curved very much. You have curved design here, curved milling design here. These are curvy edge or curvy angles here towards the butt of the knife. You have some curvature up in here. You know, you have curvature around the flipper tab, curvature around the back end, tons of curvature around the clip, and then not that much curvature around the edges. So it does give it sort of a cleaner, classier look, I might agree, but ultimately I would have preferred those edges to be tapered off just a little bit more. Again, that's a small little pet peeve kind of thing. One other thing that I want to point out is that on the Mini, which I had one recently, I had to send back due to a small issue, but the Mini, he has done sort of the knurling on the flipper tab. For those of you who have seen my Kenpachi video, you'll know that some of JD's knives, instead of traditional sort of line-based jimping, he'll do crosshatch knurling on his flipper tabs. I love that, both from an aesthetic perspective and the way it feels. I definitely prefer that. I wish more people did that on their flipper tabs. When I got the gold, I was a little bit disappointed to see that he opted for the traditional jimping. But when I got the gold Mini, it actually had the crosshatch on this back part, the part that you actually see, and then regular jimping across the top. I really like that combination. I think the regular jimping does give you a slight bit more of grip, but then this huge back section looked very stylized with the knurling, and I really appreciated that. So if he implements that on the large gold, I would definitely love that. Obviously, I didn't get that on my knife. It might just be something that he's only done on the Minis. I'm not really sure, but that's definitely something that I would have appreciated a little bit more on this particular knife. I must say, as a user, the knife's absolutely fantastic. Like I said, I have been getting some use out of it. It's got a huge blade with a really steep, really tall hollow grind, therefore extraordinarily thin behind the edge, very useful drop point shape, and it's got great ergonomics in the hand. I mean, you can see my thumbs right up in this harpoon. My fingers all fit very comfortably on the handle. It is a little bit larger. You can see I have some area sticking out on the edge here. And ultimately, this is just one of the best knives that I've seen come out of South Africa in terms of the model, in terms of this specific knife. Just, I think JD has done a fantastic job bringing JVO's design to life. And I think that the fact that these knives are extraordinarily popular right now and JD can't quite make them fast enough to meet market demand is totally justified, and I absolutely love it. This is one of my favorite knives. I was very excited to have the Mini. It's really cool to have both. And so, yeah, that's pretty much it, guys. I'm really excited to have shared this one with you. It's a bummer I didn't have the Mini to compare it to, but that's okay. And again, there's a couple of little things that I think JD could do to sort of up the ante and really compete with Thorburn. I know I make the comparisons to Thorburns a lot, but I think that's particularly relevant when we're talking about two similarly sized, similarly designed South African makers that are both experts in their craft. So there very, very slight tweaks that could be made to bring this to the next level. Again, this is a very early build. This is from the first run of 30, so small changes like the pivot screw that he chooses to use and the knurling on the flipper tab, these are things that he can implement into the knife as time goes on, and certainly aren't permanent aspects of the knife for which all future owners will have to deal with. So it'll be interesting to see how he continues to develop the model, but it's become extremely popular, and I can 100% see why. This knife is in my pocket all the time. So if you guys would like to see beautiful pictures of this knife, of course you can follow me on Instagram at tovarishworks. If you'd like to reach out to me for any reason whatsoever, you can do so by emailing me at tovarishworks@gmail.com. Thanks so much for watching, guys, and I will see you next time.